to change gears and go back to an instrumental for you now. And since we're supposed to be at the end of World War II and playing in the cantina, we're going to do probably the most infamous big band song ever done. And unfortunately, by the time of where we're supposed to be now, in 1945, this gentleman was gone, but the band still lived on, and the band is still living on. So, of course, I'm talking about Mr. Glenn Miller, and we're going to do his In the Mood for you.
Whoa, yes.
To our dancers. We're going to take a very brief intermission right now. I see some cake still over there and whatnot. We'll be back in
What else is new?
beyond our furthest thoughts, for what you lived and felt and seen, for what
How's the colonel today? Good. How you doing? Good. Thanks for coming.
leave us blessed
Thank you for coming.
with every breath that cost you arms and legs and death. Won the worst and greatest war. We owe you more. We owe you more. Thank you for your wondrous speech, for open speech and quiet street, for worship as we choose to pray, for preservation of our way. Before you go, we need to show that in your silence we still know what you accomplished and what you did, who we are and how we live. So go with love from wives and sons, daughters for a job well done.
This is the last time these guys are going to sing together.
Thank you for your wondrous speech, for open speech and quiet street, for worship as we choose to pray, for preservation of our ways, for homes and jobs and baseball games, for many colors, many names. You saved our lives and we're still free.
I'm not sure when you're talking about.
Shining sea to shining sea. Thank you, thank you, glory.
Okay, it's all right. I just saved that shirt.
Museum. Thank you all for coming out today and kind of the ominous conditions that we've got. I think it took some fortitude on your part, so thank you very much. I'm Greg Kenny. I'm the program coordinator here at the museum, and it's my honor and my privilege to sort of open up these programs here. So I'd like to get started now. Of course, we start off each program in a similar fashion. Usually we've got a color guard with us, and as I mentioned, the ominous weather, it took its toll on our color guard today. Several of the young men from the Civil Air Patrol were stuck by snow up in the high desert, so let's keep a good thought for them. They would be here if at all possible, but nonetheless, we do have our choir here today. Antique Collection is with us. They're going to perform the national anthem. If you would all please rise.
sharks and bright stars through the perilous fight. O'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare was bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does the star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave.
You may be seated. Thank you, Antique Collection. That was outstanding. I'd like to thank a few other people while I'm here today. Of course, I always like to thank our museum volunteers, either the folks in the white shirts that basically do it all around here. We've got over 300 volunteers, and they're here every day of the week to try to give you guys the best experience you possibly can while here in the museum. And I thank them so much because they help me out immensely as a staff member as well. I'd also like to thank museum members, volunteers, absolutely. Let's give them a hand if you would. I would also, of course, like to thank all museum members. If you are here today and you're not a member of the Palm Springs Air Museum, please do consider it. It's the contributions of our members that make it possible to turn on the electricity in the morning and basically to add more planes, add more new exhibits, do the programs that we're doing. So if you're not a member and appreciate what it is that you see around you, maybe you should consider it. I know we'd love to have you here as part of the Palm Springs Air Museum. Also, you'll notice in your programs, we've got some special sponsors listed. These are those that went above and beyond even becoming members. These are those that said, no, we need to commemorate the 65 years since the end of World War II, and we're going to contribute mightily to make those programs happen. So, of course, those sponsors I need to thank personally, each and every one. They really came together, wrote the checks, literally, that made these programs happen. There's a lot of moving parts that take place in these programs, and without that support, we couldn't have done them. The last group I'd like to thank, and most importantly, of course, is our veterans. If you're here today and you're a member, retired, or active duty of the armed service, if you just go ahead and raise your hand just so we can recognize you, thank you so much. And unfortunately, on that note, I do need to make a special mention today, and I wish it was something that I didn't have to do, but it absolutely is. We had a dear member, a dear volunteer at the museum pass away this week, O.B. Carter. O.B. was with us for years and years here at the museum. He's a cherished friend to many here. He passed away, but I know he's still alive in our hearts, and he is, like the slide says there, an American hero. O.B. was born in Michigan in September of 1941. You'll notice before the war got started. O.B. was accepted in the cadet program. He became a member of the 1st Air Commandos in Burma. He had 2 enemy aircraft shot down, 14 on the ground, 2 in the air. He had an extensive career in the military, and I can't do O.B. justice, but please do know that all of us here at the museum are thinking about him today, and he's a cherished member, and O.B., we love you, and we're doing these programs today thinking about you. So. With that said, we'll go ahead and start the program. We're celebrating peace at last today, coming to the end of the war. The war is now over, and we're saying thanks to those that made it happen, the allies that contributed, the merchant marines, the Coast Guard, so forth and so on. It was the little pieces that everybody played a role in that made this a winning victory for the allies. And so to tell us more about it, we're starting off today, Mike Gregory, I believe you're starting us off.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome here on the rainy and windy afternoon. It makes me feel quite at home, actually. But, in giving this brief talk about the Allied effort and support in World War II, I would like to commence and finish with just a couple of episodes that I experienced in my life that relates to the air war in 1939-1945 in Europe. It was in 1940, I was 3 years old, living in London with my father and mother and elder sister. After the Blitz commenced on September the 7th, we were bombed out with incendiaries and evacuated about 250 miles away to North Wales, and returned in 1941 when the Battle of Britain was over. The Luftwaffe had been defeated, Hitler had cancelled Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of England, embarking on Operation Barbarossa, his ill-fated invasion of Russia on the Western Front, and along with his defeats in North Africa was the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany and the Third Reich. Our memories at that time, although being young, were of air raid siren warnings, certainly synchronized sounds of the American bombers overhead, smell of the freshly dug earth of the Anderson shelters that many thousands of Londoners had and dug in their backyards, and of course the sirens sounding the all clear when the Luftwaffe had gone. In the air at that time above London and many major cities, of course, the RAF and Luftwaffe aircraft were engaged in deadly combat, and many brave aircrew on both sides paid the ultimate price for their respective causes. In Fighter Command, we were desperate for pilots and aircrew, and recruited and gratefully accepted volunteers from a number of nations, both within the Empire and outside. The British Empire at that time comprised of about 47 countries or protectorates. It was a very, very large area indeed. Canada and Poland provided enormous numbers of personnel, and some squadrons were comprised of only these nationals, which in the case of the Poles created certain communication problems, especially when they didn't want to understand and obey orders. 7 American pilots flew in the Battle of Britain, and 6 were killed, either in combat or training. Only John Haviland survived the war, and I spoke with him in 1990, and he declined to visit due to ill health and died in 2001. Of the RAF Eagle squadrons, the American Eagle squadrons that flew for the RAF, 244 flew, and 108 paid the ultimate. Both in the Battle of Britain and throughout the war, many other Empire, Commonwealth, and Allied nations and countrymen fought alongside their British comrades in various commands, such as Fighter Command, Bomber, Coastal, Reconnaissance, Training, and Maintenance. These included Australia, Belgium, Czechoslovakia, France, Greece, Holland, Newfoundland, India, Ireland, Jamaica, Kenya, New Zealand, Norway, South Africa, Southern Rhodesia, and certainly my sincere apologies if I have omitted a country and aircrew that should rightfully have been included. In mentioning the Americans who fought with the RAF, it is interesting to note that an accurate count of the numbers who flew will never be known, for many enlisted or volunteered as Canadians and were accepted as such. So other than their accents, the RAF authorities were never aware of their actual country of birth. Of the thousands who gave their lives in the RAF, regardless of which command, the Canadians and Poles made the greatest sacrifices. Of the 58,000 lost in Bomber Command alone, some 10,000 plus were listed as Canadians, and some placed the Canadian losses as high as 17,000, a considerable and significant percentage of the total in any respect. With respect to those Polish airmen and other military service who perished, The Poles were treated abominably by the British government after the war ended. While every other nation was recognized and invited to the 1946 celebrations in London commemorating the end of war in Europe, the Polish nation was snubbed by the government. In November 1948, the Polish armed forces, aided by support from a grateful British public, erected a Polish Air Force monument at the northwest of Northolt Aerodrome in London in memory of the Polish airmen who lost their lives, many of whom had taken off on their final mission from this very airfield. In 1953, the Queen dedicated a magnificent memorial at Runnymede, near the now Heathrow Airport, to all airmen who lost their lives while serving with the RAF in Northern Europe. While the Czechs and Belgians were included, the Polish airmen were again omitted. Why? Perhaps we should make that inquiry of Churchill and Roosevelt, who wished to appease Stalin during the war and in this difficult post-war period. While being the victors in that battle and defeating the Luftwaffe, who were the greatest and most powerful air force the world had known in 1939-1940, we should now be grateful that they are also now our allies in NATO and Europe in the defense of a free and democratic world. During the period of the 1990s, I became very friendly with a neighbor who is Norwegian. He could talk the hind legs of a donkey, but we spent many happy hours together sipping his favorite cognac while he spoke of his days in Norway during the war. Sigmund enlisted in the RAF and flew as a navigator over Europe in a Halifax, the four-engine heavy bomber, second only to the Lancaster, and the aircraft in which many Allied aircrew flew. In early 1944, he was shot down over Holland and spent time and the rest of the war as a prisoner of war in a concentration camp. Why a concentration camp? He's Jewish. He loved to write, but the Germans confiscated his pens, pencils, and other personal belongings when he entered the camp. On his release in 1945, much to his surprise, the Germans returned his personal effects to him. However, upon inquiring what had happened to his family, who had also been interned earlier in the war, he was informed that they had all perished in the camp. So, he said to me, they returned my tools, but they took my family. I have been a USA advocate of the Royal Air Force Benevolent Fund for over 20 years now, and have met many such Allied warriors in all commands. I listen while they talk. I treasure their memories containing both joys and sorrows, and salute them when they have gone west. The RAF Benevolent Fund's motto is, lest we forget the debt we go. Amen to that.
There are so many stories untold about World War II. Nobody has to make any up. You only need to bring up the subject and someone will come up with a true story of what happened there or then. World War II was one of those cases where not only did all of the Americans band together in a manner never seen before or since, but so did the rest of the world. And much of that has gone untold. We don't even know about some of these things. To put this in its proper perspective, you need to understand, for those of you who don't remember that, for whatever reason, when World War II ended, everyone was so happy to just forget about it, that much of it died in the process. And part of that died was the loyalty that we owe to so many of our allies, and many of them gone completely unrecognized, and you just heard the story about some of them. The one I'd like to talk to is about the Mexican Air Force. And I would guarantee you that if I were to ask for hands, which I won't do, there wouldn't be more than just a very smattering out here of people that ever even knew that the Mexicans did have an Air Force that fought in active combat in World War II. It was the 201st Fighter Squadron. They flew in the Pacific. They were kind of Johnny-come-latelys, as I was. They put together one squadron that went through training, and they went through training in Mexico, and ended up graduating their entire squadron at one time in approximately April, and there seems to be a little discrepancy about the exact date. But it was approximately the middle of April, or the first 2 weeks of April of 1944. And at that time, when they graduated, they were combat pilots. It wasn't as though our Army, Air Force, and Navy did, where we graduated and then went through training in combat aircraft. They went through the whole schmear at one time, and when they were finished, they were not only ready to go overseas, they were on their way overseas, just that fast. They went to the South Pacific, actually it was the Central Pacific, where they flew the same kind of combat missions that every other fighter squadron was flying at that time. There were not that many P-47s in the Pacific. Mostly that load in the fighter area was carried either by the Navy or the primary Army fighter at that area was the P-38. But there were some P-47s, and this was one of them. And it was just by a happenstance that I found out that there was a Mexican Air Force. Because it turns out that the 201st Fighter Squadron was attached. It was not a member, it was attached to the 58th Fighter Group in the Pacific. The 58th Fighter Group was the one that I became associated with in Korea. And that's how I found out about these fine men. And it was my great pleasure a while back to actually encounter a few of them. There are not many of them left, as you can well imagine. Most of them were a little bit older than I am. I bet you didn't know anybody who could fit into that category, but it's true. Not many. This was their emblem. And they, while they were not what we would classify as an outstanding fighter squadron, they were certainly good. They did their share, they took their losses, and they flew a very tough airplane to fly, and a very good one, and did it well, and came back with about a 2-to-1 ratio. Mostly what they did was support type work, which was common in the Pacific for fighters, but you never knew what was going to go on there. And they handled their share. So today, I wanted to pay just a little bit of tribute. See if I can get that thing to change for me. Well, and this is what they look like. A great bunch of guys, and we did have for quite a while 2 of them that were in and around here quite often. I haven't seen them lately, but I'll tell you, they have my respect. At this time, it's really hard to put together all of the things that occurred there, the different people, the different nations that were on our side. Because by the time we got well into the war, and by then I'm talking about 6 months or less into it, the whole world had taken sides, except for 2 or 3 nations, and we're not sure about them. These were the people that helped all of us, along with our own people at home. And so with that, I pay my respects to the 201st Fighter Squadron, the Mexican Air Force. And with that, I'd like to introduce Bob Andrade.
Of course, the next can you hear me? The next subject is China. Okay, we know China's the biggest and oldest civilization. We go back to the 30s when the Chinese and the Japanese were not getting along, and the Japanese decided that they're going to invade China. They say that that the war started in September the 1st, 1939. When I look at this country, I think it started on 7/7/7, which is July the 7th, 1937, when the Japanese attacked China. I think we've all read about Shanghai, read about the rape of Nanking. This did happen. So here we have a country here that is actually defenseless. They had an air force that was nothing but biplanes, and the leader was Chiang Kai-shek, along with his wife, Madame Chiang Kai-shek. They came to the United States, and they found a person by the name of Chenault. Now, Chenault was a contemporary of Billy Mitchell, and if you know about Billy Mitchell, you saw that he ran into a lot of problems because he believed in having the United States Air Force. And of course, eventually, there was a court-martial of Billy Mitchell. Well, being a contemporary of Mitchell, they gave him a bad time, and they kind of aced him out. And he ended up in the hospital as a captain in the United States Air Force. And about that time, the Chinese were really, really hurting badly. So they came to that hospital and they asked Chenault if he would come to China and do an inventory of their planes and kind of help them out. He jumped out of it and he went to China. He got to China and started his inventory. And it so happens that the Chinese person who did the other inventory, I think, claimed they had 500 planes ready to fight. When he got done, I think there was 50 planes ready to fight. Of course, the Chinese, whenever you made a mistake like that, you got beheaded. But he prevented this particular officer from being beheaded. So we started working with that Air Force. And then at this time, believe it or not, Hitler, Stalin, and Mussolini did a lot of the training over there and helping the Chinese against the Japanese. Those are 3 of our future enemies. So eventually they went back to Europe, and that left Chenault with nobody. Here it is now 1941. 5 years of fighting the Japanese. All the Japanese did was bomb, kill, no strategic thing. And finally, they said, they're about ready to surrender. They had this one last chance, and that was to come to the United States and get volunteers. So they approached Roosevelt, and Roosevelt said, well, we're neutral. We can't send anybody over there. But in April of 41, we had already started the Lend-Lease program. Of course, if you understand the Lend-Lease program, that is giving aid to Russia, Britain, and to China. In China, it was the supplies would come in through Rangoon and up the Burma Road into Kunming, China. So they finally convinced President Roosevelt that we're going to fight them why don't you let them go? So he signed an executive order saying that they can resign their commission become civilians, and go. Well, at that time, it sounded great. You know, Chenault says, I want men that have 500 hours of fighter time. It sounded good, didn't it? But guess what? No way was he going to get people with 500 hours of flight time in the fighter. He kept lowering the standards, lowering the standards until he was taking people that flew PBYs. One incident there, I just read the diary here, that he got to Burma to train, and the last time he had landed an airplane was in 1939. What was he doing over there? That's the way it was. So they trained these men that went over there, and women. There was 2 women it was called the AVG, American Volunteer Group. We all know them as the Flying Tigers. So they were the nucleus of our force over there. In fact, when I was a child, we were losing the war, and the whole country, the morale was down, until we heard about the Flying Tigers. And the headlines of what they were doing, the morale just came back up. So after the Flying Tigers disbanded, we start building up our forces, the American task force over there, and then we finally pulled a soldier, and I underlined a soldier, General Stilwell, but sent him over there. So he was in charge of, the Chinese and the British, what's the word? They hated each other. So how do you get them to fight together? So that's one thing, ability that Stilwell had. So they used him to be the liaison. So he got it all together so they could fight together. And so eventually he trained the Chinese army in India. And that's what did most of the training. So that's where the biggest forces were over there in China. And the Chinese put up a good fight, and naturally it included Burma and India and flying the hump. And so this is one big part of China that a lot of people really don't know about. And I think that right there should help you a little bit, okay? Thank you.
Good afternoon. Just, if you don't know about the Allies, most people don't know about what I call the Forgotten Armed Force. The Coast Guard dates back to 1790, served in a cutter service, but when it's given its present name in 1915, the legislation said it would at all times be one of the armed forces of the United States. But different than in peacetime, it was under the Treasury Department, but during time of war or when the President so declared, it would be part of the Department of the Navy. So in November of 1941, President Roosevelt ordered the entire U.S. Coast Guard to become part of the Department of the Navy in the same sense the Marine Corps is the Department of the Navy. So during World War II, the Secretary of Navy oversaw the Navy, the Marine Corps, and the Coast Guard. They did a number of things. In the 1930s, the Coast Guard was the only armed force that had no reserves. The Army, Navy, and Marines did. So in 1939, at Admiral Weishi's suggestion, they formed a civilian volunteer reserve force made primarily up of boat owners. But as World War II had already started in Asia, was about to start in Europe, they realized they needed military reserves, so in early 1941, they amended the legislation and had a military reserve, like the other services called the Coast Guard Reserve, and the former civilian volunteer reserve was named the Coast Guard Auxiliary. Like the Civil Air Patrol somewhat today with the Air Force, there were 67,000 auxiliaries served in World War II. All volunteers, they were mostly people that couldn't, or they were people that were too old or medically disqualified, but they could serve as an unpaid temporary volunteer doing a lot of jobs during that war as well. So they served as well as the the Coast Guard Reserve with everyone else. And auxiliaries alive and well, I'm a member of it, and there's even a unit here in the desert. So the Coast Guard had women in it. They were called spars. The name comes from the Coast Guard motto, Semper Paratus, always ready. So they put those two together. There were 10,000 enlisted women and 1,000 officers. The person on the right is Dorothy Stratton, who was the director or commander of all the spars, former university administrator. After the war, she became the chief executive of the Girl Scouts of America. They served, as the other women in the service did, mostly in this country. Later in the war, they were allowed to go to Hawaii and Alaska. One of the things the Coast Guard did, where it gets its name from, it literally guarded the coast. There were over 30,000 miles of shoreline between the Atlantic, the Gulf, and the Pacific, patrolled by 24,000 Coast Guardmen during the war, initially 2 at a time, then later with dogs, mostly German Shepherds, and horseback as well. So they're guarding the coast going back and forth. The Coast Guard also patrolled the harbors for port security, even with aviation. As you see, there was a Grumman Goose. Same plane is over your left shoulder in the back of this hangar. That's flying over New York Harbor early in the war, checking for sabotage and other problems that might come. So they're doing that. They had some Coast Guard vessels. Most of the Coast Guard vessels in 1939-40 were too small to go in the open seas. The biggest ones they had were these Secretary or Treasury class vessels, 327 feet. They went immediately serving with Navy squadrons, doing convoys and anti-submarine warfare. But in addition to its small fleet, the Coast Guard also completely manned, as you see there, over 350 Navy vessels and almost the same number of Army vessels. And as I put up there just for your 70% of all the Coast Guardsmen who served at sea served in a total Coast Guard crew aboard a Navy or an Army ship during that war, seeing action in all theaters as well. Mostly served in frigates, destroyer escorts, troop carriers, transports, tankers, and cargo ships. Coast Guard aviation, at this time almost all seaplanes and amphibians, helicopters were just coming into their experimental stage during World War II. What you see here is a Grumman GF-2 Duck, one of the smaller amphibians, and on the right, a Martin P-5M. But the most numerous aircraft the Coast Guard flew in World War II was a consolidated PBY Catalina, the 5A and the 6A, a nice one parked out in the ramp just outside this building as well. In addition to these, they also flew Grumman J4F Widgeons, the Hall PH-3, Douglas RD-4, which is a modified Dakota DC-3 as well. In addition to flying these patrols off the coast in the harbors, there was also one completely Coast Guard aviation squadron, VP-6 Coast Guard, made up all of Coast Guard aviation personnel. You can see their area of responsibility. Their headquarters were in, what's the name of the town? Okay, it's Narsarsuaq. My Danish is not too good. In the southern tip of Greenland, they also had another airfield in Reykjavik, Iceland, but they threw anti-submarine and convoy patrols in that area as well. Besides serving there, they also served in Europe, landing many of the troops, both the troop transport ships as well as most of the Coast Guardmen were the coxswains on the landing craft that brought the troops ashore on D-Day in June 1944. That's what the coxswains saw as the people went ashore, putting mostly Army troops in Europe ashore there. Also served in Europe, putting Marines ashore in amphibious operations. The photo on the left is the Coast Guard equivalent of the flag raising at Iwo Jima. That's become an iconic photograph for us because it's hard to read, but it's two Marines holding a sign to say, the Marines thank the Coast Guard for putting them ashore in Guam, and it goes on to say there. The person on the right is Seaman First Class Douglas Monroe, the only Coast Guardsman ever to get the Congressional Medal of Honor. He got it posthumously. He lost his life getting Marines evacuated from the beach at Guadalcanal. So every Coast Guardsman proud of him, of course. Besides landing troops, fighting submarines in the Pacific and the Atlantic, a new thing that came about in Iwo Jima as well, this is after that, There were Coast Guard landing the Marines on Iwo Jima, important battle. During World War II, navigation was very important, and a brand new device known as long-range aided navigation, electronic signal. You could try to plot your position. Highly classified, but it was an all-weather system. Didn't need good weather, didn't need to see the sun or the stars or the ground beneath you. And the Coast Guard manned these Loran transmitting stations all around the world, in Europe, the North Atlantic, the Pacific, hastily built with these little Quonset huts, erected a transmission station, making it possible for aviators and ships to know very accurately where they were located at. They told me I had 10 minutes, so I'm trying not to go over that, so I just want to whet your appetite. This is one in the Pacific, obviously. Lots of people served in the Coast Guard, as it mentions there. That's the statistics for the number of men and women that served during World War II. 574 were killed in action, and others were killed in training accidents. That was a monument that I used to love to see in Battery Park in Lower Manhattan. Last time I was there a couple years ago, they were doing some renovations there and it disappeared, and they put it in storage someplace, so I'm not sure where that statue is. Let me conclude. Well, I should say, of course, they sunk submarines. The best way to summarize the Coast Guard's contribution, my last book on the Coast Guard was a history of the Coast Guard for Coast Guardmen, and I have a chapter on all the battle streamers on the Coast Guard flag, so people in the Coast Guard know what each of those banners are and what they stand for. And this is what I wrote for why the World War II victory banner is on that flag. Victory in World War II hinged in preventing enemy submarines from cutting sea lanes, the amphibious capability to land soldiers and Marines onto enemy-held territory, and the ability to sustain them by sea once there. The Coast Guard played a vital role in all of these, contributing greatly to the Allied victory. So it's a much bigger story, but just to introduce you, like the Mexican Air Force nobody's heard of, the Coast Guard did a very valiant job in this war as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Doug. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Harold Williamson, and I get to talk to you today about one of my favorite subjects, women. When I told my wife I get to talk about that, why she wasn't sure that I was capable. But anyway, yeah. I'm going to talk about the history of women, particularly as it relates to women in the military in World War II. I wasn't there, but I did a bunch of reading, and so I have some information I'm going to share with you. It's appropriate that we talk about enlisting women in the military. Women in the military in World War II all began in May of 24th of 1942, when recruitment started on the East Coast. There were 13,000 women volunteered on the first day. In the city of New York, there were 1,400 women waited in line up to about 12 hours for enlistment purposes. In Washington, D.C., women that were waiting in line did something that has never ever happened before or since. You ran Washington, D.C. out of paperwork. Now that has to be a record. Anytime, it could only take the force of a bunch of American women to run Washington, D.C. out of paperwork, okay? Maybe you ought to go volunteer and do that again. When it was all over and done with, after the 2 years, there were WACs, women accepted for volunteer auxiliary Army Corps. There were 143,000. Women accepted for volunteer emergency service, that was the WAVES, 86,000. As Doug said, SPARS, the Coast Guard Auxiliary, I have 11,000. Doug, does that sound about right? 11,000 SPARS? Yes. Okay, good. Our figures match. Lady Marines, there were about 18,000. Does anybody know what they called the Lady Marines? What was that again? And what did it stand for? I didn't hear you. You're not going to tell me what it stood for? Oh. Anybody want to tell me what BAM stood for? Well, officially, and that was an official name, it was widely utilized as the name for the women Marines during World War II, and it stood for Broad-Ass Marines. And that was a proper title. Now, they wouldn't get away with it today, and every time I use it, when I give this speech about you gals, I catch hell. And you didn't help me out either, so it's supposed to be your fault. All the branches of services had their own nurses as well. It amounted to about another 60,000 women that were in the various nurse corps. When the WACs originally were trained, they were trained at Fort Des Moines, Iowa. Their initial uniform consisted of 3 brassieres, 2 girdles, and their uniform allotment was largely designed by male tailors, and as a result their skirts were a little too tight, and when they went to do the calisthenics their skirts rode up, so they had a few extra motions when they were doing their exercises, and it was rather embarrassing until they finally had to get their uniform allotment resized and redesigned. Their girdle and their bras were, according to the recruiting posters, were done in a rich brown color. I think you'd otherwise call it olive drab. One of the unique things that we need to talk about, particularly for us, about women that were in the service, is our WASPs. Palm Springs, during World War II, was a ferry command base, and we had a large WASP detachment that came through this field because as the aircraft were manufactured in Southern California, they were often sent here for eventual deployment and assignment to various parts of the other bases across the country and ultimately across the world. And as a result, the WASPs that were detached here were headquartered out of Long Beach, and they picked the aircraft up here and transferred them to other locations. The WASPs were headed up by our desert's own personage, Jackie Cochran, who happened to have her home at the other end of our valley. And she was a very dynamic person, headed the WASP. The WASP started out, there were originally 25,000 that were volunteered. There were 1,800 that were accepted. Out of the 1,800, there were 1,074 who finally became WASP, and they flew 60 million miles during the 2 years that they were in existence, and they flew virtually every type of military aircraft that we had in the air services during World War II. They were never considered military personnel. They were considered civil service employees. They had to pay their own uniform costs. They were allowed to stay in various base housing whenever it was available. If there were none available, they paid for their own housing off-field. When they were ferrying aircraft across country, hopefully they could catch military flights back and forth. They were based at 120 different airfields across the country. It was a rather tough existence for those gals. They were expected to carry firearms, which they did because a lot of the aircraft had Norden bomb sights or various armament, and so they did carry their own sidearms. They were summarily disbanded by Hap Arnold in 1944. Click, just like that, they were told to go home. When they went home, they had to pay their own way home. Records were sealed, and they were not allowed veterans benefits until during Carter's administration in 1977. It wasn't until then, until 1977, that they were granted full World War II veterans benefits. So they were a very you know, it was not fair to those ladies, but they did one hell of a job. They freed up a lot of pilots, and they did a lot of very fine duty during World War II. There are some rather funny anecdotal things that women did during World War II as well. Doesn't necessarily have to do with the military, but you ladies, you learned how to go into bars by yourselves and have a drink and smoke and pick up a few other habits that sometimes some of us guys don't necessarily agree with. There was if you were an Army or a military serviceman's wife and your husband was overseas, you got an allotment check for $50 a month. And there were some rather enterprising wives that decided, hey, that was a pretty good deal. So there were a few enterprising military wives that went about collecting husbands. And the record was a gal by the name of Elvira Taylor who collected 7 military husbands before the FBI finally caught up with her back in Virginia. And she did very well. There was another funny little true story. It seems that there were 2 swabbies that were in a pub in London, and they were bragging about their wives, and they decided to share their picture of their wives. The only problem was when they got sharing the picture, they'd both been stationed at the same base, and when they pulled the picture out of their billfold, it was the same picture. Well, the shore patrol couldn't even put them in the same brig. They had to keep them separate. So there were a lot of funny little stories that went along with, as a result of the role of the American women during World War II. But suffice it to say that the role of American women during World War II changed dramatically. After the war, women, the money they saved when they were working in the defense plants, 10, 12 hours, 6 days a week, did a lot. When it came to recovery after the war, went a long way to buying new cars, houses, and that sort of thing. And when John L. Lewis, the labor leader, said, you know, you gals go home, you ladies said, no way, we like what we've learned to do, we're going to stay here. American women became the model of womanhood for the rest of the world, and you girls deserve one hell of a pat on the back and congratulations, because you have really, World War II was one hell of a victory for female womanhood in America. So you guys give the ladies a hand, and it was one hell of a victory. Okay? Blaine?
One of the most important groups of women in World War II we've not talked about, and I'm going to spend about 30 seconds praising them, and that's our nurses. I know very few people who have ever spent any time in the service who wouldn't agree with me that the first time you open your eyes when you're lying on a hospital bed and you look up and there's this pretty face in front of you saying, how are you feeling? All of a sudden you feel a lot better. To all those nurses, my gratitude. Thank you. And now I'd like to introduce a good friend of mine, but more than introduce him, I'm going to introduce what he represents and let him tell you about it. The bright light that came on when you were overseas, didn't matter where you were, what you were doing. Overseas work, and particularly in flying, where the action comes and goes a lot, it's usually described as hours and hours of sheer boredom interrupted by brief moments of stark terror. And I don't know anything that describes it better than that. And when it subsides and you're back to those many, many hours of sheer boredom, every once in a great while would come that bright light, the USO tube.